Hey kids, welcome back to On Stage, Off Stage. This is episode 114, February of 2019. Our guest this month is S.P. Monahan. S.P. is a playwright, an actor, and works as a development funding assistant at the Lark, an international theater laboratory based in New York City. S.P. penned an essay that appeared on the Lark's blog in December of 2018. The essay was called Dear Cisgender Writer, and in it, SP encouraged cisgender writers not to shy away from including transgender characters in their work. As a cisgender playwright, I initially found this a somewhat uncomfortable prospect. How do I, as a cisgender playwright, include a character whose life I do not fully understand, and do so without it being a gratuitous inclusion? How can I include trans characters and do justice to the trans community?
Sort of a red herring. I mean, if a playwright, cisgender or transgender, if a playwright decides that they're going to write a play that includes transgender characters and that they are going to rightfully maintain that the play must be cast with transgender actors playing those transgender characters, they're making their play much harder to produce. There are a lot of theaters in parts of the country that are going to pass on that because they're going to think that they don't have the resources to cast that appropriately. So I'm not especially concerned with if a playwright, has a play where there's a minor character. If the playwright decides they're going to make that minor character transgender, that really doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I think it's fantastic. Regardless of whether or not that gender identity is important to the plot, just by virtue of the fact that they're including a transgender human in their vision of the world, I don't think that the tokenism question really applies. I mean, if that play gets produced, a transgender actor is being cast, assuming that the writer crafted that character with, respect and humanity, there's not going to be any harm caused. And if the worst case scenario in that is, if a writer is being looking for sort of attention at having written that transgender character, that doesn't really bother me just because they've written a transgender character and they're calling attention to a transgender human. Assuming all other things about it are okay and respectful and presents that character, as I said, with humanity, I don't really think that's a problem. Having said that, I was a little surprised. I thought when I wrote this blog post that I wrote for the Lark, Dear Cisgender Writer,
right.
I thought that I made it clear, but perhaps not clear enough. I was not necessarily saying that I think cisgender writers should take it upon themselves to write, quote, transgender stories, to write stories that are expressly about the transgender experience. I wasn't really advocating for that, or I wasn't intending to.
Well, that would be an extraordinary leap.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you said that. But I, to be honest, I did see in some of the response that I got to the post on social media that was the first place that people's minds sort of were going was, there was one very high-profile cisgender musical theater writer in particular, and I really love her work. And sort of right off the bat, she asked, is it okay for me then to write a musical about a trans person? Should I do this? And then on the flip side, I got feedback from another trans playwright on Twitter who said, cisgender playwrights, we should not be issuing this call. Or if we are, we should include sort of the very explicit caveat that they need to, have a huge amount of sort of consultancy from trans artists and other trans folks. And I really sort of in my head, you mentioned, why did I write this piece for the Lark's blog?
Yeah, what caused you to set pen to paper on this one? Because this is a very big, touchy subject.
It is, and it's funny because I was very intentional about writing it, but I really took for granted sort of the audience that it would reach. Because, I work at the Lark. It's my full-time day job. So I was asked by someone if I had any interest in writing something for the blog, by someone in our communications team, not leading me to, in any direction about what I should write about, but just offering that that's a space where I could write something if I was interested. So I just sort of did that, and I was spurred to write this because of a conversation that I had with a collaborator of mine who is cisgender. He's a cisgender musical theater writer, and we recently were commissioned to write a musical that it's a 2-character musical, and one of the characters is transgender. And he said, how he would not have written this piece without me, and that makes sense to me, where I'm the book writer, so the story sort of came from me. But then he sort of went a step further and talked about how, for him as a cisgender writer, he feels like he can't include trans characters, and he feels touchy about including characters with disabilities in his work because he doesn't feel that that's his place.
Well, I think a lot of that comes from, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but I had a play.
No, yeah.
I had a short play a few years ago. Okay, I had a number of characters who were non-binary. Okay, for a reason. It was basically 8 dildos in group therapy, but that's besides the point. And one of the actors that I cast is trans, and he came up to me and said, "Okay, one of the questions you need to ask here is why is this character trans? Why is this character gender fluid? Because if you write about a black person, somebody's going to ask, why is this character black? Why does this character need to be black? What is your relationship to the black experience? What is your relationship to the trans experience? And what gives you the right to appropriate my existence, okay, in one of your works?" And I was quite taken aback by this. The question had always been there. And I always tried to justify who I wrote about with something in the script that meant that this person, this character, had to be trans. This person had to be black. This person had to be female. This person had to be whatever the characterization is. So I think we're talking around the same thing here.
When you get into the question of appropriation, and that's definitely like a very charged and real feeling for a lot of people from different marginalized communities.
Sure.
I am a playwright, but I was a child actor, and so part of me feels like I also definitely wrote this piece, and I've been thinking about it from sort of an acting perspective, because there are so many roles in plays that get written every year that the gender of the character, the identity of the character, the race of the character is an open question. I mean, it could be, you could have minor roles in a play that could be played by, an actor that's cisgender or transgender, across a racial spectrum, ability, across many intersections.
Absolutely.
It could be cast.
Yes.
However, there's the tendency when it comes to that job of casting director is to sort of honor the playwright's vision, the playwright's intent. And, we see constantly, especially when we're talking about estates and plays by playwrights who are dead, estates getting into battles and shutting down productions because they don't agree with casting a role as a different race or gender than it's been previously played or than the author may have explicitly expressed while they were alive.
Exactly. We're talking about the Albee thing.
Yeah, the Albee thing and the recent revival of All My Sons that's coming up, where the director departed from the project because of disagreements with the Miller estate. And like, I can think of many others, the Beckett estate, the Brecht estate, the Thornton Wilder estate. So part of me thinks, and I come back to, I'm thinking like specifically of a play, not that I think this playwright, I'm not like faulting the playwright for not doing this, but I think of this play that I saw just a couple years ago at Hero Arts Center, where there was a character who was a barista, and like that barista character could have been a trans woman. By specifying in the script, on behalf of the playwright that this character is trans, regardless of whether or not she doesn't need to talk about her gender identity in the course of the play. But what you're doing is you're guaranteeing a transgender actor a job.
Right.
That's really hard. It's really hard to be a trans performer. And so I mean, for one thing, there are no answers that I can necessarily provide, like the right answer. All I have is sort of my take. And on the other hand, with that play that I just mentioned with the barista, there was another play that I saw a few years ago by a trans playwright where there was a trans woman who ran a pawn shop. And there was a scene where, you know, she talked about gender transition, where she talked about hormone replacement therapy. And it caught me by surprise because it seemed like extremely, at least from my perspective, personal information for her to be sort of volunteering to like a stranger who's come into her pawn shop. And so one part of me does wonder, you know, did that playwright feel the need to justify the existence of the trans character in the world? I mean, see, I feel sort of icky saying that.
No, it's a very
I know you mentioned that
icky situation.
It was a trans actor who said that to you, but I feel sort of icky just about the idea of like having to justify a trans character's existence, because I don't have to justify my existence in the world. I mean, there are times when I'm made to feel as if I do, but like I exist. So the idea that you, in writing a play, have to justify the existence of a trans character, that just like feels icky to me. We exist in the world. Justification ends there.
It's a long road to normalization. I mean, there are identities in society that are normalized. And there are identities now that are on the road to being normalized because the playwright writes the play. And depending upon who that playwright is, whether or not those characters are a regular part of his, her, or their world, is a small bubble right there. But then it goes to the theater, and then it goes to casting. And whether or not you find somebody who is culturally appropriate or genderally appropriate to fit that role is another step. And then it goes to the audience. And if it goes to an off-Broadway audience, you're going to get a certain kind of people whose feeling of normalization is fairly wide. If it goes to, and I apologize to the folks in Nebraska, but you might get a much narrower scope of what is normal. And when you say, yes, you don't have to justify your own existence, that is perfectly true. It's a question of, like I said before, if I am a writer from, let's say, a cisgender writer, okay? I have to be very careful if I'm worried about treating you as a trans person with the respect or using your identity as an aspect of my play that is, while, yes, I'm giving a trans actor a job, yay for me, that's wonderful. Why am I doing that? Why? What does it serve the play to have that in there? You write in your article, don't let the fear of being called out prevent you from bringing a trans character to life in your world. Don't be fragile. For me, it's not a question of being fragile. It's a question of respecting you as a person through my work. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I hear that, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the intentionality with which you express that. At the Lark, there's we just came back from a staff retreat, and we have discussion guidelines, and my favorite discussion guideline is essentially that, impact is more important than intent. And I think that the impact that happens a lot, the impact of cisgender writers shying away from incorporating transgender characters into their work is that there are less transgender characters in the theatrical canon. And I definitely appreciate that. It would be, I'm sure, also, meaning no disrespect to the good people of Nebraska, that it would be received differently, and that there would be audience members who would be shocked if there were a play that they're going to see that has a barista character who's trans and it's not addressed or it's not spoken about explicitly. That's just that person who exists in that world. I think that would be great, though. Where I'm going, and I didn't realize sort of that this is what I was feeling until this conversation, so I'm very grateful for being able to have it. So thank you, George. But I guess I'm feeling like this is another step we need to take to start. It is definitely, I hear everything you're saying about wanting to treat transgender characters with, the utmost dignity and respect, because you want to reflect that dignity and respect to the trans folks in your life and those in the world. I think, ready or not, we need to start taking the plunge that the next step in normalization is to just let go of some of that apprehension. Mm-hmm. Because I assume if you're writing a character, regardless of their gender identity, that you're already, and this is a benefit of the doubt that I'm just sort of extending to all playwrights, mm-hmm. because I love playwrights. I assume that you're already treating that character with dignity and humanity and care and respect. And the fear of, well, why should this character be transgender? The first thought that pops into my head is, well, why should they be cisgender? Just because I assume that's, the majority of the population, that's the dominant mm-hmm. culture, what it dictates and what it expects. But I'd love to see more people upend that question or reject that question. Why should this person be transgender? Why should I be transgender? Why should anyone be transgender?
Yeah.
Because we just are, because we exist.
In a sense, that's a harder question, I think, than the one I asked.
But I sort of just feel like the question is in and of itself, like, kind of, the question that I asked is just sort of ridiculous, because why should this person wear a hat? Why
right.
should this hat exist? These just are things that exist in the world.
They do.
They do. I definitely feel, when it comes to sort of appropriation, if it's an appropriation of trans narratives, because I was in a table read, this is about 3 years ago, so I had only recently come out as, it had only been about a year since I'd come out myself as mm-hmm. trans, non-binary, and I was asked to be in a table read of a play. I was not given the play ahead of time, and it was about like a group of boys, cisgender men, who in the 1990s in a college fraternity were sort of experimenting with drag, and then one of them sort of was confused about their gender identity and potentially started identifying as transgender. And I did get upset when I read this play, because it did feel appropriative. Part of the reason it felt mm-hmm. appropriative is because all of the entire sort of cultural frame of reference surrounding the trans identity was a like very cisgender perspective. The play centered around like Shakespeare and actors in Shakespeare in the Elizabethan era dressing as women.
Absolutely.
And I sort of, that's not like a thing that in trans culture, if this character as expressed in the play has now immersed themselves in trans culture of the 1990s in New York, in sort of the Paris is Burning era. Like, they're not going to run into a bunch of people talking about Elizabethan actors. Like, that's not the conversation. So it felt sort of unresearched, in the same way that, like, it would have felt unresearched if this playwright had written a play set in the 1880s and had a bunch of anachronisms in it. There's that. I feel like I lost the thread partway through there with what I was thinking.
It's a big question.
It is.
It's an extremely emotional question, and it can be very confusing trying to navigate the landscape of every consideration that you need to take into account with this. I do appreciate talking to you about this, and I think this conversation needs to happen more, because there are a lot of people out there who do not understand what non-binary means, who do not understand how a how a person can be transgender, because we've grown up with these stereotypes and we've grown up with these walls and borders that only the brave dare to go beyond. So I think conversation is the key. And I was talking about normalization.
And I just think, normalization and conversation, and I think the visual is critical. I think seeing transgender people is critical, and people is critical to the process, of normalization, cultural sense, but sort of also just simply for our survival. And cisgender writers, it's one thing the theater, but also I extend what I said to television. I mean, how many roles are there that are, under 5 lines day players in a television episode, like what would it take for a writer in a writer's room to say, I've decided that this barista or this cab driver or this doctor is trans, without the show having to be pose, which is fabulous, or be transparent, without having to make it a program or a narrative that is centered on the sort of quality of transness and the nature of gender itself. Just put that person there. And I did say, as a slight caveat to that, which I think also addresses the question of appropriation, I said in my article, if Warner Brothers said, we're going to make a major motion picture about, insert trans icon here. We're going to make a major motion picture about Marsha P. Johnson, about Sylvia Rivera. Yes, I would rather that the writer who gets hired to tell that story be a transgender writer. For many reasons, including that I'd love to see a trans writer get that paycheck.
What other kind of responses did you get from this essay? Because you intimated earlier that you may have written a larger essay than the amount of words you put into it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I got some response that was direct, and then I also felt that there was some sort of indirect zeitgeist response as well. In terms of direct response I received, I mentioned that cisgender musical theater writer who was engaging with it, and I also had I had 2 responses from trans folks, one of whom was saying that if a trans character is being included in something, the cisgender writer must consult with a trans person first. And I sort of agree. I feel perhaps when writers are talking about how other writers should comport themselves in a process, I feel like they are oftentimes sort of reflecting what their own writing process is. And so I don't know this to be a fact, but I would guess that writer who said that is herself the kind of writer who would get a consultant about a topic that she felt, she needed more background. Because I see so many writers come through the door of the Lark who all work so vastly differently, I don't know that I just would sort of put that blanket requirement, because I guess I just am inclined to give playwrights the benefit of the doubt. And I feel like I just assume that playwright will have done their due diligence, will have done the research that is sort of necessary to communicate the human qualities of that person. And that very well might include many plays about many different identities. It might include reaching out to a person and seeing if they are, amenable to doing some emotional labor for you by, delving into their experiences so that you might, fully reveal the humanity of the character you're writing. So that was one bit of response I received. And then the sort of zeitgeisty response that I referenced is this essay that came out by Nitzan Sharf on HowlRound. It came out 8 days after my blog post in Lark.
Right, and I read that as well, yeah.
And I wouldn't be arrogant enough to think that this was an actual response to what I wrote. That I assume that he was writing this, to express what he is feeling about theater and trans theater right now.
That's a big issue, and I think a lot of people are sort of concerned with it.
It is. We're all thinking about it, and I'm glad that a lot of people are thinking about it. But we sort of almost off the bat had a different take, because he expresses how when he hears that there's a play that has a transgender character in it, he goes to see it thinking, what new frontiers of gender identity are going to be explored in this piece. Mm-hmm. And I guess I just don't have that. I while on the one hand, it is representation is so important and it is so powerful to see oneself and one's own experiences reflected back to them in the theater. I guess I go to see, I don't just sort of assume that all pieces of theater that include transhumans in their world I just don't feel like they must reveal new elements of gender identity or,
Well, so many people go to
what comes to
theater to
mind is,
see, reflections of their own experience, which has either been subdued or censored or not given the main stage and the prime time. And representation and acknowledgement is critically important to every human being on the planet. And
it's super important. But having said that, while my gender identity and my transition over the past 3.5, 4 years definitely been, I would say, like the most defining element and journey of my life in these past few years, it's not the only thing that's happened to me. It's not the only thing I've experienced. And, I've been in love in that time. And it would be amazing to see a trans character on the stage or on television who falls in love, but I don't feel, I would see myself very reflected in that, but I don't feel like I necessarily, in addition to that, need to see the psychology of that person's gender identity, explored or mined to the minute detail. And an example I feel is so wonderful is the musical Head Over Heels, which just closed this past weekend. It ran on Broadway. It opened in August. It's a jukebox musical, the music of the Go-Go's. That's an adaptation of Philip Sidney's The Arcadia, which is, a poem from the 16th century. And it had the first trans woman opening and starring in a role on Broadway, Peppermint, playing a non-binary character who used them pronouns. Ben Brantley, took a lot of heat in the summer, rightfully so, for writing in his review of the piece a line that was pretty derisive of that character's pronouns. But in the musical Head Over Heels, while gender is definitely something that is deeply explored as it relates to some of the characters, in the Arcadia, like in much Elizabethan era writing, there is a character who crosses to be in disguise.
Sure, yeah.
So there are definitely, gender is a huge theme in the piece, but the character of Pythio, played by Peppermint, it's not the only defining trait of that character. They are just inherently fabulous and wise, and they're the oracle. There are so many elements to that person. I don't feel like I necessarily had anything new about the non-binary experience revealed to me, but oh my Lord, I so appreciated. I cried. I saw it 3 times, and there's the Go-Go song, I'm Mad About You, and in the very last time they sing it, the character who's in love with Pythio sings I'm Mad About Them, and an entire Broadway theater erupts into applause over the love and over this person's pronouns and identity. And it's just, it was beautiful without being, it was also beautiful because it was so joyful.
It sounds
I feel
wonderful.
it was wonderful. It wasn't perfect. Nothing's perfect. And it was written by, I will point out, it was written by cisgender writers. And so there are a couple of moments in the piece where I feel like, I would have done that differently. And I do feel like, this line here and this line there, they're a little bit ciscentric, and they're a little bit
not in the ballpark.
Yeah, they're not like way out of the ballpark, but they're definitely not how I would have written it.
But like
I'm not going to say like that's fine. Nothing's perfect, but also that's like, it's okay. I can call that out. I can say that this line, it was like a huge punchline. It got a lot of laughs, and I think that maybe, like, while that might have been a funny line for cis people, it might have not been a funny line for trans people. I can say that.
Yeah.
And that itself is okay. The actual act of calling out is fine. I wish that there were less of a all or nothing, that if someone gets called out for something, that it means like they've failed. I mean, I
think it's just people keeping tabs on each other. I mean, we'd all like to produce work that is good and has depth and is true to not only the characters, but decent to the people in the room with us. And many of us are going to make mistakes, no matter who we are, no matter how much research we do, and no matter how much effort we put into making something as perfect as possible. It's not going to be. And being called out, like you said earlier, is one way for people to maintain this conversation and to keep track of who we are and where we're going, I think.
I agree. The last thing I'll say about this wasn't even about feedback I received. I read this a little bit earlier, and it's gender, but the playwright Danye Love, who has been a Lark Fellow and a Lark affiliated playwright for a couple of years, he shared a post a few months ago that was about the similar, although not certainly not identical, issue of writers and race in the theater. And the post that he shared was calling for writers sort of stop writing roles that they then say could be played by any race. And the call to arms was sort of do the work, do your homework, write a play that has a character of color that is specific to that character of color's, culture and identity. And if you don't succeed, be willing to be called out and to learn from that and, do that. And like I said, that was another thing about some of the feedback I got on my articles. A lot of people very, very quickly wanted to go to, well, how does this intersect with race? Which is why I point out that though similar, they are certainly not identical situations. But that resonates with me too. That's where that line that you mentioned, "Don't be fragile," sort of came from.
Yeah.
I think it is better to write a transgender character and have someone correct you and give you the ability to update it and revise and improve how you portray the humanity of that character than it is to not try.
I agree with you, but it's a risk too. People are afraid of misrepresenting and or even worse, insulting somebody you've never met.
I know, and I love that. I love that feeling exists. I know that, of course, there are people who maybe don't care about that, and those aren't the people I'm talking to.
Right.
I was specifically talking to the people who do care, because just by virtue of the fact that they do and that they don't want to be appropriative or to misrepresent or to injure or offend, I give the benefit of the doubt and have faith that that writer will take the necessary care. And I want them to try. I want them to believe in themselves that they'll take that necessary care as well.
Let's change over a little bit here. I want to talk more about you. You are a playwright. Let's talk about your work. And what I usually do with writers I'm not immediately familiar with, I ask the same thing. Who and what do you write about? What was your last play about? Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, I have many projects that I juggle at once. So the last two pieces that I worked on quite recently, I have a play called Aunt Jack, which is a bit dense, so hold on for the short version.
Okay.
It's about the son of a gay historian and a drag performer who is gay, identifies as gay, and himself in his 20s falling in love with a woman, and the complications that presents to his family. That's a play I had produced in Fort Lauderdale, Florida over the summer, and also in Randolph, Vermont. And then the other piece that I worked on a bit more recently than that is I had a workshop at the York Theater of a musical I've been working on for a couple of years called Tyrants, which is about Edwin Booth, who's the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who was the most famous actor in America in the 19th century, who mostly a shadowy footnote because of the horrible thing that his brother did.
Right.
I think there is a theme in my work. I definitely do think that identity, how one sees themselves versus how one is seen by the world, is something that has run through everything I've written. What is the limit of our responsibility for our community? So I feel like I often write about folks who are either not taking responsibility for something that they ought to, or who are trying to take responsibility for something that's past. Those are definitely the themes that interest me the most.
You got anything coming up that we should know about?
Yeah. So the play I mentioned, Aunt Jack, is going to have its New York premiere in June of this year at Theater for the New City, which is a theater I love very dearly in the East Village, Manhattan.
I want to touch on one last thing, and then I will let you go because you're busy and this is the middle of your workday. But you mentioned being a child actor, but you didn't mention working with Charles Busch, who is legendary in the business. Vampire Lesbians of Sodom and many other hilarious plays that were pretty much groundbreaking at the time. What was it like working with him?
Well, it's been the most defining experience. It's been the most defining relation in my career. I was a child actor, and when I was years old, I got a call from my manager saying that I had an audition for a workshop at Manhattan Theater Club of a new play that was going to star Patti LuPone. Didn't say who the playwright was. Patti LuPone, like the 11-year-old queen that I was. And I just said to my mother, I have to get this part. I must. And I went in for an audition and learned that the play was by Charles Busch, who I had heard of because this was only a couple of years after Tale of the Allergist. Mm-hmm. I think it had closed just a year earlier. So I had him, but I hadn't been allowed to see any of his plays at that time in my life. So I go into the audition room. I'm reading a scene that's between this character. They took place at a theater summer camp, but it was about the adults. And so I was auditioning to play the only child in the play, who was really sort of the outcast that was based sort of on Charles himself, on his younger self. Yeah. And so I was auditioning for that, and I'm reading a scene with the Patti LuPone character. But I go in, and the reader is Charles. And I auditioned for thousands of things when I was a child, including many very exciting, cool things where I read with many exciting and cool people. But that's the only one that I could close my eyes and I could, moment for moment, remember what the audition was like. And it's very funny, actually. It just occurred to me that I'm sitting here at the Lark, which is 4 floors down from Manhattan Theater Club. So I'm working in the building where I had this sort of life-changing experience. But I read with Charles, and he was luckily as taken with I was with him, and he really saw a kindred spirit in me. I was a very eccentric kid. My frame of reference in terms of popular culture was mostly relegated to the 1940s through the 1960s, and I didn't have anyone who really shared those interests, including in my family. You know, my family is not in the theater at all. They've been incredibly supportive and were very supportive of me going into the theater, but I always say, you know, my mother knew that there was something that Charles could offer me in terms of relating to me and in terms of understanding me that even she herself couldn't. And so I did this workshop of this play. It didn't end up, you know, going on to Broadway. And then Charles wrote me a part in this annual Christmas show that he has called Times Square Angel, which is at Theater for the New City, where I'll be doing Aunt Jack. And so he wrote this part, Jimmy the Newsboy, for me. And I've been playing it every year, once a year, since I was 11. So I've been doing it, I think this past year was my 15th year. And this environment where every person half of the cast, more than half of the cast, drag, and where pronouns were sort of tossed around interchangeably. And then when I was about 13, I kept in touch with Charles. My mom kept in touch with Charles. And when I was 13, he reached out to my mother and said, you know, I'd be very interested in taking Sean, which was what I went by back then, to the theater. And so my mother said, okay. And so for about once a month for my entire adolescence, Charles and I would go to the theater, and he'd take me backstage most of the times to meet people, and we'd get dinner, and he really sort of became an anti-Mame for me. And also because he was, in addition to the gender question, because he was a playwright performer, I never saw a distinction between the two, and I always saw myself as being a writer even before I started writing anything. So then when I decided to go to college for playwriting, it seemed just like the most natural thing in the world. And he was so supportive, and he read all of my first drafts all through college. And sometimes he still does, which is very nice. And Aunt Jack, it is. And my play Aunt Jack, and also I have a musical called Diva Live from Hell, which I did 2 years ago. They're really sort of tributes to him. I mean, I so wanted to be like him. You know, I feel like most everyone has that family member who they just adore and want to be like, if it's one of their parents or grandparents or an aunt or an uncle. And for me, that was Charles. I just absolutely wanted to be exactly like him. And so, it's really been like the most defining relationship, certainly of my life in the theater, and definitely one of the top defining relationships in my life.
It sounds like an extremely fortunate thing.
Don't I know it? I really am so – I was so lucky. Not only is it an experience, you know, and for all the reasons you enumerated that many people don't get, also just for a young queer kid who was very sheltered and didn't realize they were queer yet because they just didn't have that vocabulary, to be seen by someone who saw me and knew who I was, who didn't have any questions, and who was just entirely willing and able to see me and accept me for who I am. I mean, I wish that every person in the community could have that, because it's the greatest gift of my life.
Everybody should be that lucky. Everyone should. Well, S.P. Monahan, this has been a wonderful conversation to have had with you, and thank you so very, very much for being here and having this conversation. Please tell us how my audience can find out more about you. Do you have a website? Is there a way we can, you know? And
thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation for me as well. I have my website is Monahan, MONAHAN.NYC. And that's the best way to find out about me. And then there's also, if I can put in a small plug, I'd encourage people also to visit larktheater.org for more articles and essays like the one that I wrote. So that's larktheater, THEATRE.org.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, George.
Hey kids, thanks for listening to Onstage Offstage. Onstage Offstage is produced monthly, and all of our shows can be found at onstageoffstage.org and also on iTunes. If you enjoy what we do, please recommend us to your friends. Don't forget to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at OnOffStage. And if you are a theater artist with an upcoming project of interest or work in a part of theater we haven't covered yet, or know of someone in the theater world who'd make some great chat, please send us a note at info@onstageoffstage.org. Onstage Offstage believes in and advocates for a world where all people are free to live their lives as they wish, in peace and without fear. We believe in universal respect, diversity, and equality in all areas of life for all people, no matter what their nationality, race, religion, age, sexual status, or gender. Onstage Offstage will never promote or endorse those who seek to diminish others because of who they are. I'm George Sapio. Thank you once again, and happy theatering to all of you.